The first thing I remember is the smell of antiseptic and the particular blue of the privacy curtain they'd pulled around my bed, a blue that doesn't exist anywhere outside of hospitals. My left arm was in a sling, 3 ribs were cracked, and there was a monitor beside me that beeped every 1.2 seconds, a sound I counted because counting was easier than thinking. It was October 14th. I'd been hit by a box truck that ran a red light on Cleveland Avenue at 6:40 in the morning, on my way to drop Eden off at daycare before my shift. She was 11 months old. She'd been in her car seat in the back, and by some miracle, the kind of miracle that makes you believe in something bigger, for about 30 seconds, she walked away with nothing but a bruise on her cheek from the impact of the seatbelt strap. I didn't walk away with anything. I spent 3 days in Riverside Methodist Hospital in Columbus, mostly sedated, in and out of consciousness, with my phone sitting on the nightstand like a dead thing. My parents lived 40 minutes away in Westerville. They had Eden. The paramedics had called them directly from the scene because my emergency contact was still listed as my mother, Carol Whitfield, from before I'd had a chance to update it after my divorce. I have the call log. The call connected at 6:52 a.m. and lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. In those 3 days, I received 0 calls from my parents, 0 texts, 0 photos of my daughter. I want to be precise about this because precision is something I've learned to value. Not one single piece of information came from the people who had my baby. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't know until the 4th day, is that Eden had been left in her crib for hours at a time, in clothes that hadn't been changed, while my mother and father sat 15 feet away in the living room, watching television. On the 4th day, at 9:14 in the morning, my phone rang. It wasn't my mother. It was my grandfather. And he was already in the car. My name is Mara Whitfield. I'm 29 years old, and at the time of the accident, I was a supply chain analyst for a mid-sized logistics company headquartered just outside Columbus. The kind of job where nobody at a dinner party knows what you actually do, but where, if you're good at it, you become the person an entire warehouse network quietly depends on without realizing it. I was good at it. I'd been promoted twice in 4 years. I managed contracts worth low 7 figures, tracked freight across 11 states, and could read a shipping manifest the way some people read a novel, fast, and noticing everything that didn't belong. I mention this not to brag, but because it matters later. Because the skills that made me good at my job, documentation, timestamps, paper trails, knowing exactly what a contract actually says versus what people claim it says, are the same skills that, 6 weeks after that hospital stay, would quietly take apart my entire family's version of reality. Eden was 11 months old. Her father, Dale, had left when I was 4 months pregnant, moved to Tampa, and sent child support sporadically enough that I'd stopped counting on it. I didn't resent that as much as people expected me to. I'd built a life that worked. A 1-bedroom apartment in Clintonville with a fire escape Eden liked to look out of, a daycare 3 blocks from my office, a 2015 Honda CR-V with 98,000 miles on it that I'd just finished paying off 2 months before the accident. I tell you all of this because I want you to understand, I was not a person who needed saving. I was a person who occasionally needed help, the way every single parent occasionally needs help, and the people who were supposed to be my safety net had, for my entire adult life, made it very clear that help was something they offered selectively. Specifically to my brother Caleb. Caleb is 2 years older than me. He's never held a job for longer than 14 months. At the time of my accident, he was 31, living in my parents' finished basement, between opportunities, as my mother liked to phrase it, a phrase she'd been using since he was 24. My parents, Carol and Richard Whitfield, are both retired. My dad from the Postal Service, my mom from substitute teaching. They live in a 4-bedroom house on Schrock Road in Westerville that I would later learn, with some surprise, they did not actually own. When the hospital called them that morning, my mother's first words to the paramedic, I know this because I eventually requested the call recording as part of something I'll explain later, were, "Is she going to need us to come get the car from the impound, or can that wait?" Not, "Is she alive?" Not, "Is the baby okay?" The car. The impound lot. That was the version of my family I'd lived inside my entire life. I'd just never had it on a recording before. To understand why what happened on day 4 hit me the way it did, you have to understand the pattern. And the pattern wasn't new. The pattern was just background noise, the kind you stop hearing until someone points it out. Example 1. When I was 16, I made the varsity tennis team, the only person from my high school to do it as a sophomore. My parents missed the regional tournament because Caleb, who was 18 at the time, had a big audition for a community theater production of Grease in Cincinnati, 2 hours away. He didn't get the part. I won my bracket. Nobody was there for either outcome, but only one of us got driven 2 hours for the attempt. Example 2. When I graduated from Ohio State, debt-free because I'd worked through all 4 years and gotten a partial scholarship, my parents threw Caleb a graduation party the same month for finishing an online certificate program in digital media, a 6-week course. There were balloons. There was a sheet cake from Kroger that said, "Way to go, Caleb." My graduation, 3 weeks earlier, got a card. Inside the card was $20. Example 3, and this is the one that still sits strangest with me. When I was pregnant with Eden, 7 months along, working full-time, going through the early stages of my divorce, my mother called me to ask if I could watch the house for 10 days while they took Caleb to Myrtle Beach for his birthday. Not come stay there. Watch it. Drive over every day. Water the plants, check the mail because, and I quote, "We don't trust the new neighbors yet." I did it. I drove over every day for 10 days, 8 months pregnant, because that's who I was in that family. The responsible one. The one you could count on to handle things quietly so the people who actually mattered could enjoy themselves. What I didn't fully clock, not then, was that watching the house had become a recurring request. Every few months, some version of it. Check on the house. Pick up a package. Meet the home inspector because mom and dad were busy. I'd done it probably a dozen times over 3 years, and I'd never once asked why a home inspector kept needing to come by a house my parents had lived in for over 20 years. That detail, the home inspector, is going to matter. I want you to hold on to it. Because here's the thing about being the reliable one in a family that doesn't value reliability. You become invisible specifically because you're dependable. Nothing about you requires their attention. You're not a problem to be managed or a star to be celebrated. You're just infrastructure. The pipes in the wall. Nobody throws a party for the pipes. Nobody checks on the pipes when they're under pressure. Until the pipes are the only thing that knows where the water shutoff valve is. I didn't know that phrase yet, the water shutoff valve. I wouldn't know it, not really, until I was sitting in my hospital bed on the morning of day 4, watching an unknown Vermont number light up my phone screen, and hearing my grandfather's voice say, calm as anything, "Mara, I'm 40 minutes out. I need you to tell me your daughter's pediatrician's name." That was the moment everything shifted. My grandfather's name is Walter Whitfield. Walt, to everyone who's known him more than 5 minutes. He's 78 years old, lives alone on a small property outside Montpelier, Vermont, and for 40 years ran a regional trucking and warehousing company called Whitfield Freight Lines, which he sold in 2009 but never fully let go of, in the way that men who built something with their hands rarely do. He and my dad don't talk much. Haven't for years. Something about money lent in the 90s that was never paid back, a wound that calcified into the kind of silence families mistake for peace. I'd see Grandpa Walt twice a year, maybe. Christmas if he drove down. A phone call on my birthday, always at exactly 9 a.m., always for exactly the same conversation. How's the job? How's the baby? You eating enough? What none of us knew, what I certainly didn't know, was that my dad had called him 18 months earlier, during a rough patch, and asked to borrow $40,000. Grandpa had said no. But he'd quietly started paying closer attention after that. Made some calls. Found out my parents' house, the one on Schrock Road, the one I'd watched a dozen times, had been refinanced twice and was 4 months behind on the new mortgage. He didn't tell anyone. He just started driving down Mort on October 17th. My grandfather called me from a gas station in Pennsylvania to ask Eden's pediatrician's name, then called the hospital himself, then got back in his truck and drove the remaining 6 hours straight through. He arrived at my parents' house at 6:50 that evening. He told me later, in that same flat, unhurried voice he uses for everything, what he found. The front door was unlocked. The television was on Wheel of Fortune, he remembers because he hates that show. My mother was on the couch. My father was in the recliner. And from somewhere down the hall, he could hear Eden crying. Not the sharp, urgent cry of a baby who's just started, but the worn-out, hoarse, intermittent cry of a baby who has been crying for a long time and is starting to give up. "How long has she been doing that?" he asked. My mother, without looking away from the TV, said, "Oh, she does that. She's fine. Babies cry." He walked down the hall. Eden was in the crib in the guest room. My old room, actually, in a onesie that, he said, smelled like it hadn't been changed since the night before. Her face was red and raw from crying. The bottle on the dresser was untouched and had gone warm hours ago. He picked her up. She stopped crying almost immediately, the way babies do when someone finally responds, that full-body collapse of relief. He walked back into the living room holding her and said, "Carol, Richard, how long has she been crying?" My father said without turning around, "She's been a lot since the accident. Probably just colic." "It's been 4 days since the accident," Grandpa said. That's when my mother finally looked up. And what she said next is the line I will never ever forget because my grandfather repeated it to me twice, once that night on the phone and once months later under oath. She said, "We've barely had a moment to ourselves. Caleb's been having a hard time too, you know. This has been stressful for all of us." My grandfather looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at my father. Then he said the sentence that, in my head, marks the exact line between the family I'd spent 29 years trying to belong to and whatever came after. "You had one job," he said, "and you chose yourselves." He called an ambulance for Eden, not because she was in medical danger, but because he wanted a hospital record of her condition, dehydration, and all, time-stamped and official. He packed her diaper bag himself. He didn't raise his voice once. He didn't argue. He just gathered what belonged to his granddaughter and walked out the front door, and 40 minutes later, he was sitting beside my hospital bed with Eden asleep on his chest, and I was crying in a way I hadn't let myself cry since the accident itself. We never went back to that house. Not for Christmas, not for a birthday, not for anything. What none of us knew yet was that, in about 6 weeks, that house wouldn't be theirs to invite anyone to anyway. I was discharged 5 days later. Grandpa Walt stayed in Columbus for 2 weeks, got a room at a Hampton Inn off I-71, drove Eden to her pediatric follow-up himself, sat with me through physical therapy appointments, made oatmeal every morning because it was the one thing he knew how to make that a baby could also eat. During that time, he told me something he'd been sitting on for almost a year. "Remember the home inspector? The one I'd met at my parents' house multiple times over 3 years, always because my parents were busy? Those weren't routine inspections. They were appraisals for refinancing. My parents had refinanced the Schrock Road house twice, once in 2021 and again in early 2024. The second refinance had pulled out $58,000 in equity. According to the paperwork, that money had gone toward home improvements. According to my mother's Facebook, that same spring, Caleb had gotten a loan from family to put toward a failed food truck venture in Athens, Ohio, a venture that lasted 4 months and folded by August. Here's the part that changed everything. Grandpa Walt, after the loan request he'd turned down 18 months earlier, had done something my parents didn't know about. He'd contacted the title company that handled the original purchase of the Schrock Road house back in 1998. Because here's the detail nobody in my family ever talks about. When my parents bought that house, they couldn't qualify for the mortgage on their own. Grandpa Walt had co-signed. And as part of that arrangement, drawn up by a lawyer friend of his in Burlington, he'd retained something called a reversionary interest, essentially a contractual right that, under specific default conditions, the property would revert to him. Nobody had ever triggered it. For 26 years, it sat in a filing cabinet in Vermont and used, mostly forgotten, by everyone except the one person who'd written it. The second refinance, the one that pulled out $58,000, had been done without notifying him, which, Grandpa's lawyer confirmed, was itself a violation of the original agreement's terms. Combined with the fact that the mortgage was now 4 months delinquent, with a notice of default already filed by the lender, the reversionary clause was active, enforceable, and only Grandpa Walt could choose whether to enforce it. He hadn't told me any of this before the accident. He told me he'd been watching, deciding what kind of grandfather he wanted to be about it. He said the accident, what he found in that house, answered the question for him. I'm not doing this because of the money, he told me, sitting in my apartment with Eden asleep in the next room. I'm doing it because I want you to understand something. You are not the only person in this family with leverage. You've just always been the only one who'd never use it. I asked him what he meant. He slid a folder across my kitchen table. Inside was a copy of the 1998 purchase agreement, the reversionary clause highlighted in yellow, the 2 refinance documents, the notice of default, and one more thing, a second document, drawn up 11 months earlier, after the loan request, before any of this happened. It was a deed, quitclaim, prepared but not yet filed, transferring his reversionary interest, the entire claim on the Schrock Road property, to me. He'd already decided. He'd just been waiting to see what kind of family he was protecting it for. I didn't file anything right away. That's not how I operate, and honestly, it's not how Grandpa operates either. We're alike that way, something I only really understood that month. What I did instead was spend 6 weeks doing what I do for a living, building a record. First, I requested the hospital's intake documentation for Eden from the night Grandpa brought her in, the dehydration notes, the diaper rash assessment, the time-stamped weight measurement showing she'd lost 4% of her body weight in 4 days. I requested it not for any lawsuit. I want to be clear, I never sued my parents, but because I needed an objective, third-party, time-stamped account of what had happened. Not my word against theirs. A pediatric nurse's chart notes. Second, I called the hospital where I'd been admitted and requested the call log from October 14th, the one where my mother asked about the impound lot before asking about me or Eden. It's a recorded line. They're required to keep it for a period. It took 3 calls and a written request, but I got it. Third, and this is the part that took the longest, I had Grandpa's lawyer in Vermont, a careful, soft-spoken man named Arthur Ng, who'd known Grandpa for 30 years, formally review the reversionary clause and the 2 refinances. Arthur confirmed everything Grandpa had told me, and added one detail Grandpa hadn't mentioned, because the second refinance violated the original agreement and the property was now in active default. Grandpa's interest wasn't just theoretical anymore. He could file for reversion immediately, and the lender, who wanted anyone solvent to take over the delinquent loan rather than foreclose, would likely not contest it. Fourth, I didn't tell my parents any of this was happening. Not one word. For 6 weeks, the only contact I had with them was 2 unanswered texts from my mother asking when I was bringing Eden for a visit. I didn't respond to either. What I did instead was wait for Thanksgiving. Not out of cruelty. Out of strategy. Thanksgiving was the one occasion my entire family still treated as non-negotiable. The one day a year Caleb, my parents, my Aunt Denise, and occasionally my mother's sister Pam all sat at the same table. It was also, not coincidentally, the date Arthur recommended for serving the reversion paperwork, because Ohio's rules on notice required it to be delivered in a way that couldn't later be claimed as never received, and a family gathering with witnesses solved that problem rather elegantly. I didn't go to Thanksgiving. I hadn't been invited that year anyway. My mother's text had said, verbatim, "We're keeping it small this year, just immediate family," which, given that I was her daughter, told me everything I needed to know about where I currently ranked. But Grandpa Walt went. He drove down from Vermont again, 12 hours, arrived at the Schrock Road house at 2 p.m. on Thanksgiving Day with a folder under his arm and Arthur Ng's paralegal on standby by phone as a witness. He didn't yell. He didn't make a speech. He told me afterward it took less than 10 minutes. He sat down at the table, declined the turkey, and said, "Before we eat, I need everyone here to see this." What they didn't know was that the next 10 minutes would determine whether any of them had a house to come back to after the holiday weekend. Grandpa Walt laid 4 documents on the dining table, in front of my mother, my father, Caleb, Aunt Denise, and my mother's sister Pam. All of them mid-bite. All of them suddenly very still. The first was the 1998 purchase agreement with the reversionary clause highlighted in yellow. The second was the 2024 refinance paperwork, the one done without his knowledge, in violation of that clause. The third was the notice of default from the lender, dated 3 weeks earlier, for months delinquent. The fourth was the reversion filing itself, already drafted, already notarized, ready to be filed with Delaware County the following business day. He explained it the way he'd explain a freight manifest.
Calm.
Sequential. No raised voice. He told them the house had, for the past 4 months, technically been in breach of an agreement older than I was. He told them the lender had already initiated default proceedings. And he told them that as of the following Monday, ownership of the property would revert to him unless they could bring the mortgage current themselves, in full, within 10 days. Which, given that the missed payments alone totaled just over $11,000 on top of the $58,000 already pulled out and spent, they could not. My mother's first words, he said, were, "You can't just do this." "I'm not doing anything," Grandpa said. "I'm telling you what's already been done by the bank for months ago. I'm just the one who finally noticed." Caleb asked what would happen to everyone's stuff. Aunt Denise asked, bizarrely, whether this meant Thanksgiving next year would be somewhere else. "Nobody," Grandpa told me later, with something that wasn't quite satisfaction but was close to it. Nobody asked about Eden. Not one person, in that entire conversation, asked how my daughter was doing 5 weeks after being found alone in a crib for hours. That, more than anything, told him he'd made the right call. Here's what happened over the following month in plain terms. The reversion was filed and accepted, uncontested, because Arthur was right. The lender had no interest in fighting a transfer to a financially solvent party. Grandpa Walt became the legal owner of the Schrock Road property on December 2nd. He did not evict my parents. He did something I think was, in its way, more pointed. He offered them a month-to-month tenancy agreement at fair market rent, $1,650 a month, the going rate for that neighborhood, payable starting January 1st. My parents could not afford $1,650 a month. They'd been living in a house with no mortgage payment for years, just the refinance debt, which is part of how they'd absorbed Caleb's failures for so long without anyone noticing the foundation cracking underneath. Faced with an actual market rate bill, they moved out by the end of January into a 2-bedroom apartment in Reynoldsburg. Caleb did not go with them. At 31, with nowhere else absorbing his rent, he got a job, an actual one, at a distribution center, the kind of job that exists in the industry I work in, which I did not arrange, but which I also did not notice the irony of. The house itself, Grandpa eventually sold in the spring for $312,000. He didn't keep the money. He put $40,000 of it into a trust for Eden, the same amount he pointed out that my father had once asked to borrow and never repaid, except this time it would actually go to family. He gave the rest to me. Not as a gift, he was careful to say, as what he called back pay for 29 years of being the one who showed up. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. Maiden's Payback brings you a new story every week about the quiet ones who finally stopped being quiet. Drop a comment below. Have you ever discovered you had more power in your family than anyone realized? I read every single one.